The year is 1884. You stand in a chemist's shop in London, the air thick with the scent of camphor, carbolic acid, and something sweeter, more insidious. Your tooth throbs with an agony that has kept you awake for 3 nights. The pharmacist, a respectable man in a crisp collar, slides a small brown bottle across the mahogany counter. "Cocaine tooth drops," he says cheerfully. "For the child, madam. Instantaneous cure, perfectly safe." You hesitate for only a moment before handing over your coins. After all, the label promises relief. The same bottle sits in nurseries across the empire. The same white powder flows through London's most prestigious hospitals, through America's Coca-Cola bottles, through the veins of surgeons and the nostrils of society ladies. This is not the drug war, you know. This is not illegal. This is medicine. This is progress. This is Victorian civilization at its most confident, most dangerous moment, when an entire society decided that a South American plant extract was the miracle cure for everything from sadness to hay fever. And you, standing in that shop, have no idea that you're living through one of history's most disturbing medical experiments, one conducted not in laboratories, but in homes, not on criminals, but on babies. Welcome to the age when cocaine was as normal as aspirin, and far more deadly. Before we dive deep into this dark corner of medical history, if you're new here, welcome. This channel explores the brutal, honest truths of the past, the parts history class conveniently forgot to mention. If you enjoy falling asleep to the soothing chaos of historical disasters, consider subscribing. Hit that like button if you appreciate content that doesn't sugarcoat the fact that our ancestors were confidently, catastrophically wrong about nearly everything. Tonight, we're spending 2.5 hours exploring how cocaine went from sacred South American plant to Victorian miracle drug to criminalized substance, and all the death, addiction, medical malpractice, and corporate greed in between. This is a story about scientific hubris, colonial exploitation, pharmaceutical capitalism, and the thousands of ordinary people who paid the price for progress. So settle in, get comfortable, let the weight of your day dissolve as we travel back to a time when doctors prescribed cocaine for melancholy, when children's teething products contained pure extract, and when the line between medicine and poison was thinner than the white powder dissolving on your tongue. Let's begin. To understand how cocaine became Victorian medicine's darling, you need to understand the world that created it. The 1880s were a peculiar moment in human history, a hinge point between ancient folk remedies and modern pharmaceutical science, between colonial exploitation and industrial capitalism, between religious morality and scientific materialism. You live in a world without the Food and Drug Administration, without prescription requirements, without clinical trials, control groups, or peer review. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 in Britain barely restricts anything beyond requiring pharmacists to register. In America, there are virtually no regulations at all. Anyone can call themselves a doctor. Anyone can sell anything and call it medicine. Walk down any London street in 1885, and you'll pass shop windows crammed with patent medicines. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for teething babies, morphine and alcohol. McMunn's elixir of opium, exactly what it sounds like. Ayer's cherry pectoral for coughs, alcohol, opium, and antimony. The bottles are beautiful, embossed glass, ornate labels, promises printed in elegant script. Each one claims to cure everything from consumption to female hysteria. None of them list ingredients. This is the world cocaine enters, a world desperate for miracles. Because life in the 1880s still hurts, constantly, relentlessly. Despite the railroads and telegraphs, despite the gas lamps and steam engines, your body still betrays you in medieval ways. Toothaches rot through your jaw. Headaches pound behind your eyes with no relief. Consumption, tuberculosis, slowly drown you in your own blood. Pneumonia kills quickly. Childbirth kills routinely. And there's nothing, really nothing, that works. Doctors have finally abandoned bloodletting and leeches, but they haven't yet discovered antibiotics. Surgery exists, but anesthesia is primitive. Ether, chloroform, sometimes nothing at all. Germ theory is brand new, controversial, not yet widely accepted. Most physicians still believe in miasma, bad air causing disease. They still prescribe mercury for syphilis, even though it rots your mouth and drives you mad. They still recommend arsenic for complexion and vigor, even though it's literally poison.
Into this desperate, painful world comes a plant that South American indigenous peoples have used for thousands of years, Erythroxylum coca. Growing on the Andean slopes of Peru and Bolivia, chew them miners and farmers and travelers to combat altitude sickness, hunger, and exhaustion. The coca leaf is sacred, spiritual, woven into the fabric of Incan civilization and beyond. But Europeans don't discover coca through respectful cultural exchange. They discover it through conquest. Spanish conquistadors in the 1500s note that indigenous workers can labor longer, harder, need less food when chewing coca leaves. The colonial administrators see opportunity. If coca makes workers more productive, coca becomes useful. The Catholic Church initially condemns it as pagan witchcraft, then reverses position when they realize it helps extract more labor from enslaved and coerced populations in the silver mines of Potosí. For 3 centuries, coca remains largely a South American phenomenon. European scientists occasionally mention it, but the active alkaloid, the chemical compound that causes the effects, can't be isolated. The leaves lose potency during the long sea voyage to Europe. Then, in 1855, everything changes. A German chemist named Friedrich Godke successfully extracts a crystalline compound from coca leaves. He calls it erythroxylene. 4 years later, Albert Niemann refines the process, isolates a purer form, and names it cocaine. For the first time, you can transport the essence of coca, concentrated, shelf-stable, powerfully potent. The white crystalline powder contains all the stimulating, euphoric, numbing properties of the leaf, magnified 100-fold. And European scientists lose their minds with excitement. By the 1870s, pharmaceutical companies are racing to produce cocaine. Merck, the German pharmaceutical giant, began manufacturing it commercially in 1862. By 1883, they're producing and selling it by the kilogram. Parke-Davis in America begins manufacturing cocaine in 1885, marketing it as a cure for alcoholism, morphine addiction, depression, and basically everything else. Why the enthusiasm? Because cocaine actually seems to work. Unlike the vast majority of Victorian patent medicines, which are useless placebos or dangerous toxins, cocaine produces immediate, undeniable effects. Within seconds of applying it to mucous membranes or injecting it, you feel euphoria, energy, confidence. Pain vanishes, fatigue disappears. You feel, for the first time in your exhausted Victorian life, like a god. And it numbs, beautifully, perfectly numbs. In 1884, a Viennese ophthalmologist named Karl Kohler discovers that cocaine, applied to the eye, provides perfect local anesthesia for surgery. This is revolutionary. Before cocaine, eye surgery required physically restraining terrified patients while cutting into conscious, pain-filled tissue. With cocaine, patients sit calmly while surgeons operate on eyeballs with precision. The medical establishment erupts with excitement. Within months, surgeons are using cocaine for dental procedures, throat operations, nasal surgeries. The age of local anesthesia has arrived, and cocaine is the miracle that delivered it. But there's another doctor experimenting with cocaine in Vienna, a young neurologist, ambitious and brilliant, and deeply, catastrophically wrong about what he's discovered. His name is Sigmund Freud. In 1884, Sigmund Freud is nobody, a 28-year-old doctor struggling with poverty, desperate to make his reputation, in love with a woman named Martha Bernays who he cannot afford to marry. He needs a breakthrough. He needs something to distinguish himself from the dozens of other ambitious young physicians competing for recognition in Vienna's prestigious medical circles. Then he reads about cocaine. Freud orders a sample from Merck. When it arrives, he doesn't conduct careful studies. He doesn't test it on animals first, doesn't design controlled experiments. He does what many Victorian scientists do. He takes it himself. The effect is immediate and glorious. Freud describes feeling exhilaration, euphoria, a profound sense of well-being. His depression lifts, his chronic stomach problems vanish. He works through the night without fatigue, writing letters to Martha describing this miraculous substance in rapturous terms. "A small dose lifted me to the heights in a wonderful fashion," he writes. "I am just now busy collecting the literature for a song of praise to this magical substance." That song of praise becomes Über Coca, a paper published in July 1884 that reads less like scientific research and more like drug propaganda. Freud claims cocaine cures digestive disorders, cachexia, morphine addiction, alcoholism, asthma, and various neuroses. He describes it as a magical drug and recommends it enthusiastically for numerous conditions, based primarily on his own subjective experiences and a handful of anecdotal reports. The paper makes waves. Here is a respected doctor from a prestigious institution recommending cocaine for everything. Pharmaceutical companies immediately seize on Freud's endorsement. Park Davis hires him as a spokesperson, pays him to write
advertising copy. Within months, cocaine products flood the market, many featuring Freud's endorsement. Freud doesn't just write about cocaine, he prescribes it liberally to friends, patients, colleagues. He mails it to Martha. He recommends it to his mentor, the physician Josef Brauer. And then he prescribes it to his friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxau. Fleischl is suffering. Years earlier, he severed a thumb while conducting an autopsy. The wound became infected, never properly healed, required multiple surgeries and eventual amputation. The chronic pain is unbearable. To cope, Fleischl's doctors prescribed morphine. Now he's deeply addicted, injecting massive doses just to function. Freud, confident in cocaine's ability to cure morphine addiction, recommends his friends switch to cocaine instead. It seems to work, initially. Fleischl's morphine use decreases, he seems more energetic, more functional. Freud celebrates this as proof of cocaine's therapeutic value. But within months, everything goes catastrophically wrong. Fleischl doesn't stop using morphine, he adds cocaine to it. He begins injecting enormous quantities of cocaine, chasing the initial euphoria that keeps diminishing. He doesn't sleep for days. He develops paranoid delusions. He experiences cocaine psychosis, hallucinations of insects crawling beneath his skin. He scratches himself bloody. His health deteriorates rapidly. Freud watches his friend descend into madness and slowly, reluctantly, begins to understand what he's done. But by then, it's too late. Cocaine is everywhere. Pharmaceutical companies aren't waiting for longitudinal studies or careful research. They see profit. By 1885, at least 15 companies are manufacturing cocaine products. Park Davis produces a cocaine kit for doctors, containing cocaine in multiple forms: powder for snorting, solution for injection, cigarettes for smoking, even a cocaine-laced liquor for stimulation. The advertising is aggressive and shameless. Park Davis advertises cocaine as a drug which, through its stimulant properties, can supply the place of food, make the coward brave, the silent eloquent, and render the sufferer insensitive to pain. They're not wrong about the effects. They're just leaving out the catastrophic consequences. Across Europe and America, doctors begin prescribing cocaine for everything imaginable. Depression, cocaine. Fatigue, cocaine. Hay fever, cocaine. Toothache, cocaine drops. Sore throat, cocaine lozenges. Asthma, cocaine cigarettes. Alcoholism, opium addiction, replace it with cocaine. Medical journals publish hundreds of articles praising cocaine's therapeutic potential. The Lancet, British Medical Journal, Journal of the American Medical Association, all feature enthusiastic reports of cocaine's benefits, with only occasional, easily dismissed mentions of negative effects. In New York, a doctor named William Hammond, former Surgeon General of the United States, praises cocaine publicly, claims he uses it regularly with no ill effects, and recommends it for nervousness. He becomes one of cocaine's most prominent medical advocates, lending institutional credibility to its use. Dr. William Stewart Halsted, one of the founding physicians of Johns Hopkins Hospital and a pioneer of surgical techniques, begins experimenting with cocaine for nerve block anesthesia. The technique works brilliantly, but Halsted, like Freud, experiments on himself, and like Freud's friend Fleischl, Halsted becomes addicted. For the rest of his life, while building one of America's most prestigious medical institutions, Halsted struggles with cocaine and morphine addiction. He functions, but barely. He requires morphine maintenance just to work. This is one of the founding fathers of American surgery, secretly enslaved to the drugs he once thought he controlled. These are not back-alley addicts. These are elite physicians, scientists, the best and brightest of their generation, and cocaine is destroying them. But the medical establishment isn't paying attention to the warning signs because cocaine is making too much money. By 1886, cocaine has escaped medical control entirely. It's not just in hospitals and pharmacies. It's in grocery stores, barber shops, by mail order. It's in drinks, tonics, lozenges, ointments, suppositories. It's in products marketed to everyone from exhausted laborers to bored housewives to teething babies. You can buy cocaine legally, easily, cheaply, no prescription required, no questions asked. And people do, by the millions.
One of the most successful cocaine products isn't marketed as medicine at all. It's sold as a refreshing beverage. In 1886, an Atlanta pharmacist named John Pemberton invents a new drink. He's trying to create a patent medicine for headaches and nervous disorders, something that will compete with the dozens of similar products flooding the market. His formula contains two key ingredients: extract from African cola nuts containing caffeine, and
Extract from coca leaves containing cocaine. He calls it Coca-Cola. The original formula contains approximately 9 milligrams of cocaine per glass. Not enough to cause intense euphoria, but enough to provide a noticeable stimulant effect. Enough to make you want another glass, and another. Pemberton markets Coca-Cola as the intellectual beverage and the temperance drink, a wholesome alternative to alcohol. The advertising emphasizes its coca content. Coca-Cola revives and sustains. The cocaine isn't hidden or denied, it's a selling point. Within a few years, Coca-Cola is available at soda fountains across America. People order it for headaches, for energy, for the pleasant buzz. They give it to children. No one thinks twice about the cocaine content because cocaine is everywhere. Vin Mariani, a French coca wine, becomes perhaps the most popular cocaine product globally. Invented by Corsican chemist Angelo Mariani in 1863, it contains 211 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce, a substantial dose. Mariani markets it aggressively, sends free samples to celebrities, collects testimonial endorsements. And the endorsements roll in. Pope Leo XIII awards Vin Mariani a gold medal and appears in advertisements. Thomas Edison endorses it. Ulysses S. Grant drinks it while dying of throat cancer. Queen Victoria, the Shah of Persia, President William McKinley all offer glowing testimonials. Mariani publishes these endorsements in a massive multi-volume series celebrating his coca wine. By 1890, you can walk into virtually any pharmacy and choose from dozens of cocaine products. Lloyd's cocaine toothache drops promise instantaneous cure for children's dental pain. The label features a cheerful illustration of children playing. The product is pure cocaine mixed with alcohol. Tucker's Asthma Specific contains cocaine, cannabis, and chloroform. You smoke it for asthma. Dr. Bernie's Catarrhal Powder is pure cocaine you insufflate, snort, directly into your nasal passages for sinus relief. Burnett's Cocaine, they spell it with an O to emphasize the coca origin, is marketed as a hair treatment and scalp tonic. It contains cocaine. You rub it into your scalp. Rhino's Hay Fever and Catarrh Remedy is a nasal spray containing 4
hallucinating. The doctor writes, she presented the appearance of a woman dying of some wasting disease. An American physician describes treating a lawyer who discovered cocaine while researching a pharmacy fraud case. The lawyer began using it for mental stimulation while working late. Within a year, he's unemployable, destitute, living in flop houses, stealing to buy cocaine. He eventually dies of cardiac arrest at age 34. These aren't isolated cases. By 1895, hospitals in major cities are admitting patients for cocaine mania with increasing frequency. Asylums house patients whose cocaine-induced psychosis never fully resolves. But the pharmaceutical industry isn't backing down. Too much money is at stake. When doctors begin questioning cocaine safety, companies hire prominent physicians to publish rebuttals. They claim problems only occur with improper use or weak constitutions. They fund studies designed to show cocaine is safe when used correctly. This is a playbook that will be repeated throughout the 20th century. Tobacco companies denying cancer links, chemical companies denying environmental harm, opioid manufacturers denying addiction risks. The Victorian cocaine industry invents pharmaceutical gaslighting. And it works. For a while. Because in the 1890s, most cocaine users aren't visiting doctors to report problems. They're suffering quietly, ashamed, believing their addiction is a personal moral failure rather than a predictable chemical dependency. Victorian society has no framework for understanding addiction as a disease. If you can't stop using cocaine, it's because you're weak-willed, morally deficient, lacking self-control. The solution isn't treatment, it's moral reformation, or punishment. This attitude means that as cocaine addiction spreads, victims are blamed rather than helped, and pharmaceutical companies continue profiting.
The story of how cocaine went from miracle medicine to criminalized drug is inseparable from racism, classism, and moral panic. This is where the narrative becomes darker, more complicated, more revealing of Victorian society's hypocrisies. For the first decade of cocaine's medical use, the substance itself is never really the problem. When wealthy white Europeans and Americans develop cocaine habits, the medical establishment treats it as an unfortunate side effect, a regrettable complication of legitimate therapy. Addiction is discussed in medical terms: cocaine habituation, nervous disorders, conditions requiring sympathy and treatment. But when cocaine use spreads to poor communities, immigrant populations, and especially Black Americans, suddenly cocaine becomes a menacing social threat requiring criminalization. This shift doesn't happen because the drug changes. The drug is identical. What changes is who's using it. In the American South during the 1890s and early 1900s, cocaine becomes associated with Black laborers, particularly those working on railroads, docks, and in lumber camps. Employers sometimes provide cocaine to workers, just as Andean mine operators centuries earlier gave it to Indigenous laborers, to increase productivity, enable longer hours, suppress appetite. White workers use cocaine too, in equal or greater numbers, but newspapers don't write panicked editorials about white cocaine users. In 1903, the American Journal of Pharmacy publishes an article titled "The Cocaine Habit Among Negroes." In 1909, the New York Times runs an article with the headline, "Negro Cocaine Fiends Are a New Southern Menace." These articles don't present evidence, they present racism dressed as public health concern. They claim without data that cocaine makes Black men violent, superhuman, immune to bullets. They resurrect every racist trope from the slavery era: the dangerous Black man, the threat to white women, the need for white control. Dr. Christopher Koch, a physician from Pennsylvania, testifies before Congress in 1914, claiming, "Most of the attacks upon white women of the South are the direct result of a cocaine-crazed Negro brain." This is a lie. Crime statistics don't support it, but it doesn't matter. The claim serves its purpose, transforming cocaine from a medical issue into a racial threat. Southern police departments use the cocaine-crazed Negro mythology to justify violence. Police reports from this era describe officers shooting Black suspects multiple times, claiming they wouldn't go down because of cocaine-induced strength. These reports are later used to justify larger caliber weapons and more aggressive tactics. This racist panic provides the political will to ban cocaine, not to regulate it, not to require prescriptions, not to mandate accurate labeling, to ban it outright. Meanwhile, wealthy white cocaine users continue accessing the drug through private physicians. When Harrods department store in London stocks cocaine kits for soldiers during World War I, small tins of cocaine and morphine sent to the trenches, no one
calls it a social menace. When Park Davis sells cocaine to affluent patients, it's medicine. When street dealers sell to poor Black Americans, it's a crime. The 1914 Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in the United States is ostensibly a tax and registration measure, but in practice it criminalizes cocaine and opium for non-medical use. The act is passed amid a wave of racist propaganda about Black cocaine users and Chinese opium dens, thinly veiled anti-Black and anti-Asian legislation dressed as drug policy. Britain follows a similar path, but slightly later. The Defense of the Realm Act 1916 restricts cocaine sales, ostensibly to prevent Canadian soldiers from buying it in London clubs. But the enforcement is selective. Working-class users face prosecution. Wealthy users face discreet medical intervention. This is the birth of the drug war, a system that criminalizes substances not based on their actual danger, but based on who uses them. Cocaine in a wealthy doctor's office is medicine. Cocaine in a poor Black man's pocket is grounds for arrest, imprisonment, violence. The hypocrisy is staggering. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, as cocaine is increasingly criminalized for street use, it remains legally available by prescription. Dentists use it, surgeons use it, wealthy patients with private doctors access it easily, but poor users, immigrant users, Black users, they're criminals. And the criminalization has devastating effects. It doesn't stop cocaine use, it drives it underground, where purity is uncontrolled, where overdoses increase, where users can't seek help without risking arrest. By the 1920s, organized crime takes over cocaine distribution. The price increases, the purity decreases. Dealers cut cocaine with cheaper substances, sometimes inert, sometimes toxic. Users have no way to know what they're actually consuming. This pattern will repeat with marijuana, heroin, methamphetamine, crack cocaine. Every major drug criminalization follows the same script. Associate the substance with a marginalized group, generate panic, criminalize, create a black market, blame the users for the problems criminalization creates. Victorian cocaine policy establishes the blueprint for a century of
failed drug prohibition, and it's rooted not in science or public health, but in racism and class control. But before cocaine is fully criminalized, before the Harrison Act and its international equivalents close the legal market, there's one final grotesque chapter in cocaine's medical history: the treatment of women. Victorian medicine has a particular obsession with women's bodies, women's minds, women's supposed inherent weakness and pathology. The medical establishment views women as fundamentally ill, their reproductive systems making them permanently unstable, prone to hysteria, neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion. And cocaine becomes one of the preferred treatments for these imaginary diseases. Female hysteria is one of the most common diagnoses in late 19th century medicine. Symptoms include anxiety, irritability, sexual desire, lack of sexual desire, forwardness, faintness, nervousness, insomnia, fluid retention, heaviness in the abdomen, muscle spasms, shortness of breath, loss of appetite, and a tendency to cause trouble. Notice anything? These symptoms describe basically every human emotion and physical sensation, plus outright sexist dismissal of women's autonomy. Hysteria isn't a real disease. It's a medical justification for controlling women, and the treatments are horrifying. Doctors prescribe bed rest, sometimes for months. They prescribe pelvic massage. Yes, that's what it sounds like. They prescribe removal from education, work, or social activity. They recommend marriage and pregnancy as cures, and increasingly they prescribe cocaine. Cocaine for hysteria, cocaine for menstrual pain, cocaine for nervous exhaustion from reading too much or thinking too hard, cocaine for depression after childbirth, cocaine for the weakness of female constitution. The medical logic is circular and absurd. Women are naturally weak, therefore they need stimulants. The stimulants make them agitated and dependent, which proves they're naturally weak. Dr. Robert Bartholow, a prominent American physician, publishes a widely read textbook in 1891 recommending cocaine for hysteria, hypochondriasis, and melancholia, especially in women. He suggests doses of 10 to 20 milligrams, multiple times daily, indefinitely. For context, 20 milligrams of pure cocaine is enough to produce significant euphoria and physiological effects. Multiple doses daily, sustained over months, guarantees dependency. But Victorian doctors don't think women can become addicted. They believe addiction requires moral weakness, and while they view women as physically weak, they simultaneously idealize white middle-class women as morally pure. Therefore, proper ladies can't become addicts. Any problems that arise must be due to their underlying female
Pathology, not the drug. This creates a perfect trap. Women are prescribed cocaine. They develop dependency. When they seek help, doctors prescribe more cocaine or different drugs, morphine, chloral hydrate, alcohol-based tonics, creating polysubstance dependencies. The medical literature from this era includes heartbreaking case studies, though the doctors writing them seem oblivious to their own culpability. One 1893 report describes a 28-year-old woman, married, mother of two, suffering from melancholia and nervous exhaustion. Her physician prescribes cocaine nasal spray. She uses it as directed. Within 3 months, she's using 10 times the prescribed amount. She becomes paranoid, erratic, neglects her children. Her husband seeks help. The doctor's solution? Commit her to an asylum for female insanity and switch her to morphine. Another case? A woman suffers from severe menstrual pain. Her doctor provides cocaine suppositories. She becomes dependent, begins purchasing additional cocaine from pharmacies. When her family intervenes, she's diagnosed with moral insanity and institutionalized. The doctor writes that her case demonstrates the inherent weakness of the female nervous system. The systemic nature of this medical abuse is staggering. Women are diagnosed with fake diseases, treated with addictive drugs, blamed for the predictable consequences, then institutionalized or otherwise punished for addiction their doctors created. And the patent medicine industry specifically targets women because women are the primary consumers of patent medicines, the primary healthcare decision makers in Victorian households, and crucially, the most acceptable target for manipulative advertising. Ads for cocaine-containing products appear in women's magazines alongside advertisements for corsets and complexion creams. They promise energy for exhausted mothers, relief from household drudgery, cure for the sadness of domestic confinement. Rhino's hay fever remedy is advertised in Good Housekeeping. Peruna tonic, cocaine and alcohol, is marketed as woman's friend. These products are sold as necessities for female health, positioned as self-care rather than intoxication. For women trapped in suffocating Victorian domesticity, barred from higher education, careers, financial independence, cocaine offers temporary escape. The euphoria, the energy, the confidence feel like liberation. And because these are medical products, using them doesn't violate feminine propriety. But the trap closes quickly. Tolerance builds, dependency develops, the initial euphoria fades, replaced by the desperate need just to feel normal. Women hide their use, ashamed, isolated. They run out of money buying cocaine. They neglect responsibilities. They develop health problems. And society, rather than helping, punishes them.
Middle-class women who develop visible cocaine problems are institutionalized. Working-class women are arrested. Either way, they're removed from society, blamed for moral failing, subjected to barbaric treatments, cold water torture, restraints, forced labor, additional drugs. One particularly disturbing aspect of Victorian cocaine medicine is its use in gynecological procedures. Because cocaine is an effective local anesthetic, doctors use it for vaginal and uterine procedures. This is medically legitimate, better than operating without anesthesia. But some physicians prescribe cocaine to women after gynecological procedures for pain management, then continue prescribing it indefinitely. Whether this is medical incompetence or deliberate cultivation of dependent patients is often unclear from historical records, but the result is the same: women trapped in cycles of medical dependency, their doctors controlling access to the substance their bodies now require. Dr. William Stewart Halstead, the Johns Hopkins surgeon who became addicted to cocaine while researching nerve block anesthesia, performs numerous gynecological surgeries using cocaine. He's simultaneously advancing surgical technique and spreading addiction. His own struggle with dependency doesn't make him more cautious about prescribing to others. This is Victorian medicine at its most paternalistic and destructive: men controlling women's bodies, defining women's experiences as pathology, administering addictive drugs, then blaming women for the consequences. By the 1910s, as cocaine criminalization begins, women users face particular stigma. A man with a cocaine habit might be seen as tragically weak or morally compromised. A woman with a cocaine habit is seen as sexually deviant, a fallen woman, irredeemable. The early drug war targets women viciously. Arrest records from the 1920s show women prosecuted for cocaine possession receiving harsher sentences than men. Newspapers described cocaine-addicted women with particular venom, emphasizing moral degradation and sexual impropriety. This gender drug war continues for decades. Even today, women face
greater stigma for addiction, more barriers to treatment, more likely to lose custody of children, more likely to be viewed as failed mothers rather than people needing help. The Victorian cocaine epidemic establishes these patterns. It demonstrates how medicine can be weaponized against women, how addiction can be created by medical authority, then blamed on female weakness, how patriarchal control operates through the prescription pad and the asylum commitment form. And throughout it all, the doctors who created this disaster face no consequences. They continue practicing, they publish papers, they receive honors and appointments. The women they harmed are forgotten, buried in unmarked asylum graves, or erased from family histories as shameful secrets. By 1910, the catastrophic effects of unrestricted cocaine sales are undeniable. Thousands are addicted, hundreds are dead. Cocaine psychosis fills asylum wards. Crime associated with desperate acquisition of the drug is rising. The medical establishment can no longer pretend this is isolated misuse. You might expect this would lead to accountability, to pharmaceutical companies acknowledging their role in creating an epidemic, to doctors apologizing for reckless prescribing, to reformers dismantling the patent medicine industry that poisoned millions. None of that happens. Instead, the industry pivots. They don't accept responsibility, they redirect blame. The problem, they claim, isn't cocaine itself or how it was marketed. The problem is abuse by weak-willed individuals and criminal elements. Park Davis, which manufactured cocaine in industrial quantities and advertised it for everything from depression to timidity, quietly stops promoting cocaine while never admitting their advertising was dangerous. They simply shift to other products: arsenic compounds, mercury treatments, radium water, continuing the same pattern of enthusiastically marketing substances whose long-term effects are unknown. Merck, the German pharmaceutical giant that produced more cocaine than any other company, responds to growing addiction crisis by developing heroin. Yes, heroin. Bayer patents diacetylmorphine, heroin, in 1898 and markets it as a non-addictive morphine substitute and cough suppressant. They advertise it as safe for children. This is not incompetence. This is a business model. Create demand for a dangerous substance, profit enormously, ignore the consequences, and when public opinion shifts, move to the next product. Never apologize, never paid restitution, never admit wrongdoing. The patent medicine industry fights regulation viciously. When reformers, journalists, doctors, temperance activists, women's groups push for laws requiring accurate labeling and ingredient disclosure, pharmaceutical manufacturers scream about government overreach and threats to medical freedom. The American Medical Association, which should be leading reform, is compromised by advertising revenue. AMA journals carry full-page advertisements for cocaine products, opium remedies, and other dubious medicines. The advertising income funds the organization. Reforming patent medicines would mean financial loss.
It takes muckraking journalists to force change. Samuel Hopkins Adams publishes a devastating series in Collier's Weekly in 1905 titled The Great American Fraud, exposing the patent medicine industry's lies. He reveals that products claiming to be non-alcoholic temperance tonics contain 40% alcohol, that soothing syrups for babies contain morphine and cocaine, that consumption cures contain nothing but colored water and alcohol. Adams specifically targets Peruna, one of the best-selling patent medicines in America, revealing its 28% alcohol, stronger than wine, despite being marketed to temperance advocates as alcohol-free. He exposes product after product, printing the actual analyses showing toxic ingredients concealed behind reassuring marketing. The series causes public outrage. Finally, there's political will for regulation. The Pure Food and Drug Act passes in 1906. It's a weak law, doesn't ban anything, just requires accurate labeling, but it's a start. Manufacturers must list ingredients. They can't claim cures they can't prove. Mislabeling becomes a federal crime. The impact is immediate. Sales of patent medicines plummet, not because they're banned, but because once customers know what's actually in them, they stop buying. When Coca-Cola is revealed to contain cocaine, public pressure forces reformulation. By 1929, Coca-Cola removes all cocaine, though it continues using spent coca leaves with the cocaine extracted, for flavoring. But here's what doesn't happen. Prosecutions of pharmaceutical executives, financial penalties proportional to profits earned from addiction, compensation for victims, medical license revocations for doctors who prescribed recklessly. A few small manufacturers are prosecuted for mislabeling. They pay modest fines. That's it.
Executives who ran Park Davis, Merck, Bayer, who made millions selling cocaine while knowing it was addictive, who funded studies designed to conceal harm, who targeted advertising at children, face no criminal charges. They retire wealthy and respected. Their companies continue operating. Many still exist today as major pharmaceutical corporations. This is an important moment to understand. The failure to hold the cocaine industry accountable establishes a precedent. It teaches pharmaceutical companies that they can create addiction epidemics, make enormous profits, and escape consequences as long as they eventually stop and blame users. This pattern repeats with barbiturates in the 1930s to 50s, with thalidomide in the 1950s to 60s, which causes birth defects, with amphetamines in the 1950s to 70s, with benzodiazepines in the 1960s to present, with opioids in the 1990s to present. The Sackler family and Purdue Pharma, who created the oxycodone epidemic that killed hundreds of thousands, are following a playbook written during the Victorian cocaine epidemic. Aggressively market an addictive substance, ignore warning signs, fund contradictory research, blame users, eventually settle for penalties vastly smaller than profits, admit no wrongdoing. And just like with cocaine, the people most harmed, poor users, marginalized communities, people who trusted medical authority, receive no justice. One of the most disturbing aspects of the cocaine industry's non-reckoning is what happens to medical knowledge. You might expect that after doctors recognize cocaine's dangers, medical schools would teach future physicians to be cautious with new drugs, to wait for long-term data, to be skeptical of pharmaceutical marketing. But that's not what happens. Medical education continues to be heavily influenced by pharmaceutical companies. Drug company representatives visit medical schools, sponsor research, fund professorships, provide educational materials that are thinly disguised marketing. This continues throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. Medical students learn pharmacology partially from textbooks written by authors with pharmaceutical industry ties. Continuing medical education, required for doctors to maintain licenses, is often funded by drug companies promoting their products. The lesson the medical establishment should have learned from cocaine, wait for long-term safety data before mass prescribing, is never institutionalized. Instead, the pattern repeats. New drugs are marketed aggressively, doctors prescribe enthusiastically, problems emerge years later, blame is deflected, the cycle continues. Meanwhile, the people harmed by Victorian cocaine have no memorial, no recognition, no justice. Consider the thousands of children given cocaine teething products. Most are long dead, their shortened lives unrecorded. How many died of overdose, attributed to sudden infant death or failure to thrive? How many survived childhood only to struggle with addiction, their early exposure priming their brains for dependency? We'll never know. Medical records from this era are incomplete, often destroyed. The children of the poor, most affected by patent medicines, left few traces in historical record. Consider the women institutionalized for hysteria that was actually cocaine addiction created by their doctors. Most died in asylums, buried under headstones with only numbers, their names and stories erased.
Consider the Black Americans criminalized during the racist cocaine panic, imprisoned for using the same substance white doctors prescribed to white patients. Their criminal records followed them for life, barring employment, voting rights, full participation in society. These are ghosts, the forgotten casualties of medical hubris and pharmaceutical greed. And the corporations responsible? Merck is now a $200 billion company. Park Davis was acquired by Pfizer. These companies have never formally apologized for the cocaine epidemic. They've never established victim compensation funds. They don't mention this history in their corporate materials. Instead, they present themselves as life-saving innovators, developers of miracle drugs, engines of medical progress. Which is partially true. These same companies did develop genuinely beneficial medications, but that doesn't erase the cocaine epidemic. Progress and harm coexist in pharmaceutical history, and we dishonor the victims by forgetting the harm. The Victorian cocaine epidemic should be taught in every medical school as a cautionary tale. Every pharmaceutical executive should study it as an example of what not to do. Every regulatory agency should reference it when evaluating new drugs. But it isn't. It's a historical footnote, a quaint story about how naive our ancestors were, not a warning about ongoing patterns. And so the patterns continue. Behind all the marketing lies, medical malpractice, and moral panic, there's actual pharmacology. Cocaine is a molecule with specific
effects on human physiology. Understanding what cocaine actually does and why it's so addictive helps explain how Victorian society could be so catastrophically wrong about it. Cocaine's chemical formula is C17H21NO4. It's an alkaloid extracted from erythroxylum coca leaves. In pure form, it's a white crystalline powder with a bitter taste and a numbing effect on mucous membranes. When you consume cocaine, whether by snorting, injecting, smoking, or applying it topically, it crosses into your bloodstream and reaches your brain within seconds to minutes, depending on the method. Once in the brain, cocaine does something elegant and devastating. It blocks the reuptake of three neurotransmitters: dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Here's what that means. Your brain communicates through chemical messengers. Dopamine is involved in reward, pleasure, motivation. Norepinephrine regulates alertness, arousal, attention. Serotonin affects mood, sleep, appetite. Normally, after these neurotransmitters do their job, transmit a signal between neurons, they're reabsorbed, reuptake by the neuron that released them. It's a neat, efficient system. Signal sent, signal absorbed, ready for next signal. Cocaine prevents that reabsorption. The neurotransmitters accumulate in the synapse, the gap between neurons, continuing to stimulate receptors. The signal keeps firing. Dopamine floods the reward pathway, norepinephrine surges, serotonin lingers. The result: euphoria, energy, confidence, alertness, diminished appetite, reduced fatigue, increased heart rate and blood pressure, dilated pupils, talkativeness, a feeling of supreme capability. For 30 to 90 minutes, depending on dose and method, you feel like the best possible version of yourself. Everything seems possible. Problems seem trivial. Social anxiety vanishes. You're witty, energetic, capable. Then the cocaine molecules are metabolized. Your liver breaks them down. The effect ends. And here's where the trap closes. When cocaine wears off, you don't return to your baseline emotional state. You crash. Because your brain, flooded with dopamine for the past hour, has adjusted. It's reduced dopamine receptor sensitivity, decreased natural dopamine production. Now, without cocaine, you have less dopamine signaling than before you took the drug. You feel tired, depressed, anxious, irritable. You crave the cocaine high, not just because it felt good, but because normal consciousness now feels terrible by comparison. This is the neurochemical basis of addiction. Cocaine doesn't just provide pleasure, it redefines what normal feels like, making sobriety feel like depression. The more you use, the stronger this effect becomes. Your brain continues adapting to the presence of cocaine, making you dependent on it to feel normal. You develop tolerance, requiring larger doses to achieve the same effect. The crashes get worse, the cravings intensify. Meanwhile, cocaine is damaging your body in multiple ways. Cardiovascular effects. Cocaine constricts blood vessels and increases heart rate and blood pressure. This can cause heart attacks, even in young, healthy people. It can cause strokes. It can cause aortic dissection, a catastrophic tearing of the body's main artery. Long-term use causes cardiomyopathy, weakening of the heart muscle. Nasal effects. Snorting cocaine damages nasal passages. The drug's vascular constrictive properties reduce blood flow to nasal tissue, causing cell death.
The septum, the wall between nostrils, can erode and collapse, creating a hole. Victorian and early 20th century medical literature is full of case reports of cocaine users with grotesquely damaged noses. Neurological effects. Long-term cocaine use causes cognitive impairment, memory problems, attention deficits, reduced executive function. It increases the risk of seizures. In high doses or with prolonged use, it can cause cocaine psychosis, paranoid delusions, hallucinations, especially cocaine bugs, aggressive behavior. Psychological effects. Beyond the immediate crash, long-term cocaine use causes persistent depression, anxiety, anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure, and often paranoid thinking. These effects can last months after stopping use. Overdose. Cocaine overdose can be fatal. Too much cocaine causes extreme hypertension, hyperthermia, dangerously high body temperature, cardiac arrhythmia, stroke, or seizure. Victorian users had no way to measure doses accurately, making accidental overdose common. Victorian doctors knew some of this. By the 1890s, medical literature described heart problems, nasal damage, addiction, and psychosis in cocaine users. But this knowledge didn't translate into appropriate caution because economic incentives. Pharmaceutical companies profited enormously and funded contradictory research. Confirmation bias. Doctors who believed in cocaine's benefits interpreted negative reports as user error rather than drug danger. Lack of regulatory framework. No requirement to
prove safety before marketing. Cultural confidence. Victorian scientific racism taught that civilized white people could use substances responsibly, while primitive people couldn't, blinding doctors to addiction in their own patients. Poor understanding of addiction. The neuroscience of addiction didn't exist. Doctors thought willpower alone should overcome drug dependency. One particularly tragic aspect of cocaine pharmacology is how it affects developing brains. Children and adolescents are more susceptible to addiction because their brains are still forming neural pathways. Early drug exposure can permanently alter brain development. All those Victorian children giving cocaine teething drops, their developing brains were being fundamentally changed. Some developed behavioral problems, mood disorders, or addiction susceptibility that lasted their entire lives. But Victorian doctors didn't connect childhood drug exposure to later problems because they didn't understand neurodevelopment. Another pharmacological factor Victorian doctors missed: individual variation. Cocaine affects different people differently based on genetics, body chemistry, metabolism, mental health status. Some people become addicted quickly. Others use occasionally without severe consequences, though long-term occasional use still causes harm. Victorian medicine largely ignored individual variation, prescribing the same substances at the same doses to everyone. The numbing effect, the property that made cocaine seem like a miracle for surgery, is actually local anesthesia through sodium channel blockage. Cocaine prevents nerve cells from generating electrical signals, stopping pain transmission. This is genuinely useful for surgery, and modern local anesthetics like lidocaine and novocaine are cocaine derivatives that provide numbing without euphoria or addiction. This is important. Cocaine's local anesthetic property is real and valuable. Modern medicine still uses cocaine in controlled hospital settings for specific nasal surgeries where its combination of numbing and vasoconstriction is useful. The problem was never the substance itself, but the uncontrolled mass market use without understanding risks. If Victorian society had limited cocaine to supervised medical use, conducted long-term safety studies before mass marketing, required accurate labeling and dose control, monitored patients for dependency, treated addiction as medical issue rather than moral failing, the epidemic might have been avoided. But Victorian capitalism, medical hubris, and social prejudice made that impossible. Understanding the pharmacology also explains why cocaine prohibition failed. Banning cocaine didn't eliminate demand. People's brains were already chemically dependent. It just made supply dangerous and inaccessible. Street cocaine in the Prohibition era, 1920s onward, was impure, unpredictably potent, often cut with toxic substances. Users couldn't know what dose they were taking. Overdoses increased. Infectious diseases spread through shared injection equipment. Crime increased as users turned to illegal activities to fund expensive black market purchases. All the harms of prohibition, harms we still see today, flow from pharmacological realities. Addiction is a chronic condition requiring ongoing management. Criminalizing addicted people doesn't cure them. It makes them sicker and more desperate. Modern addiction medicine understands this. Treatment includes medication-assisted therapy, psychological support, harm reduction, addressing underlying trauma and mental health issues. Punishment is counterproductive. But this knowledge came too late for Victorian cocaine users, who faced moral condemnation, criminalization, and barbaric treatments like cold water torture, restraints, and forced labor. The Victorian cocaine epidemic is ultimately a story about a powerful molecule colliding with an ignorant society. The cocaine molecule didn't change. It had the same effects on Victorian brains as on modern brains. What changed was human understanding.
slowly, painfully, after immense suffering. While Europe and America were intoxicating themselves with cocaine, the source of the drug, the coca plant, was being extracted from South America through systems of colonial exploitation and environmental destruction. The coca plant is indigenous to the Andes. Archaeological evidence shows cultivation dating back at least 4,000 years. Indigenous peoples, Inca, Quechua, Aymara, use coca in religious ceremonies, as medicine, as mild stimulant for work at high altitude. They chew coca leaves mixed with alkaline substances, traditionally lime from shells or ash, which causes a slow release of cocaine alkaloids. This traditional use produces mild stimulation, not euphoria or addiction. For millennia, coca is integrated into Andean life sustainably. Cultivation is limited, controlled, sacred. Then Europeans arrive. Spanish conquistadors in the 1530s in Italy
condemn coca as pagan devil worship. The Catholic Church bans it. But when colonial administrators realize coca-chewing indigenous workers can labor longer in the brutal silver mines of Potosi, policy reverses. Coca becomes a tool of exploitation. Spanish authorities establish coca plantations, force cultivation, and distribute it to enslaved and coerced workers. This is the beginning of coca's transformation from sacred plant to commodity. And once it becomes commodity, it enters the logic of capital: maximize production, minimize cost, extract maximum value. For 3 centuries, coca remains primarily regional, but when European chemists isolate cocaine in the 1850s-60s, demand explodes. By the 1880s, European pharmaceutical companies need coca leaves by the ton. Peru and Bolivia become the primary suppliers. Coca cultivation expands dramatically, spreading from traditional highland areas into lowland regions where the plant grows faster and larger. Indigenous communities that traditionally grew small amounts of coca for local use are pressured or forced to expand production. Land is seized for coca plantations, traditional agriculture is displaced, local economies become dependent on single crop export. This is classic colonial extraction. Take a useful plant, industrialize its production, export the raw material to Europe or America for processing, sell the refined product globally at enormous markup, return almost no profit to the source country. The economics are stark. A Bolivian coca farmer might earn pennies per pound of coca leaf. Merck or Park Davis refines those leaves into cocaine, sells it for hundreds or thousands of times more. The wealth flows one direction, towards European America. And like all colonial extraction, it's enforced through violence. When Bolivian or Peruvian workers resist labor conditions, they're met with government force. Local governments, often controlled by elites with financial ties to export industries, side with foreign companies. European pharmaceutical companies negotiate directly with South American governments for coca rights, often through corrupt arrangements that benefit officials rather than populations. Companies build their own plantations, hire their own security forces, operate as de facto governments in coca-growing regions. Environmental destruction follows. Expanding coca cultivation requires clearing forest. Traditional sustainable farming gives way to monocrop plantations that deplete soil. Increased cultivation leads to erosion, deforestation, water depletion. Then, when cocaine addiction becomes a problem in Europe and America, do these countries blame their own pharmaceutical industries or medical practices? No, they blame South America. The racist logic is perfect. Cocaine is a foreign contamination, a primitive drug from backward nations corrupting civilized societies. Never mind that European and American companies created demand, refined the product, and marketed it aggressively. Never mind that white doctors prescribed it. The problem is Andean coca. This rhetoric enables new forms of colonial control. The United States begins pressuring South American governments to restrict coca cultivation. International treaties, the Hague Convention of 1912, the Geneva Conventions of the 1920s-30s, frame coca as international threat requiring global prohibition. But here's the hypocrisy. These treaties allow coca cultivation for pharmaceutical companies producing medical cocaine while banning traditional indigenous use. Indigenous peoples who have chewed coca leaves safely for thousands of years are now criminals for practicing their traditional culture. But Merck can legally import cocaine to manufacture cocaine for wealthy white patients. Bolivia and Peru resist international pressure, arguing that coca is part of their cultural heritage and that prohibition is colonial overreach. They're correct, but they lack the power to resist American and European demands. By the mid-20th century, the international drug control regime is fully established. Coca cultivation is heavily restricted, monitored by international organizations, permitted only under license, primarily to supply pharmaceutical companies. But prohibition doesn't eliminate coca cultivation. It just makes it illegal and profitable. When legal markets close, illegal markets emerge. By the 1970s-80s, coca cultivation for cocaine production is controlled by drug cartels, primarily in Colombia, but with significant production in Peru and Bolivia. The war on drugs, launched by the United States in the 1970s and escalated in the 1980s-90s, devastates South American coca-growing regions. U.S.-funded military operations spray herbicides that destroy not just coca but food crops, poisoning water and causing health problems. Forced eradication programs burn fields, often without compensation, leaving farmers destitute. Violence explodes. Cartels fight each other and government forces. Paramilitaries,
Guerrillas and security forces all commit atrocities. Civilians are caught in the middle. Hundreds of thousands die. Millions are displaced. And coca cultivation doesn't decrease, it just moves. Destroy coca fields in one region, cultivation shifts to another. The balloon effect. Squeeze one area, it expands elsewhere, defines the drug war. Meanwhile, indigenous communities still want to use coca traditionally. In Bolivia, coca has constitutional protection for traditional use, but international pressure continues. The United Nations classifies coca leaf as a narcotic, despite evidence that traditional chewing is not harmful and not equivalent to cocaine use. This is ongoing colonialism. Indigenous knowledge, indigenous rights, and indigenous sovereignty are subordinated to drug policies created by the same Western powers that caused the cocaine epidemic in the first place. There's a direct line from Victorian pharmaceutical companies extracting coca to modern cartels. The difference isn't moral. Both are profit-seeking entities operating in the space between supply and demand. The difference is that one was legal and created the demand that the other now serves illegally. And the people suffering most, then and now, are South Americans. In the Victorian era, they were exploited laborers on colonial plantations. In the modern drug war, they're farmers caught between cartels and militaries, civilians in war zones, migrants fleeing violence. The Victorian cocaine story isn't just European and American, it's global. It's a story of how powerful countries export their problems, blaming and punishing weaker countries while avoiding responsibility. Cocaine's history is inseparable from how it's been represented in culture, literature, media, and popular imagination. These representations shape policy, influence behavior, and often obscure truth. In the 1880s-90s, when cocaine is respectable medicine, cultural depictions are uniformly positive. It appears in advertisements as sophisticated, modern, scientific. Vin Mariani's promotional materials feature elegant illustrations of satisfied upper-class consumers. Cocaine products are associated with modernity, progress, civilization. Arthur Conan Doyle, in his Sherlock Holmes stories, casually mentions Holmes using cocaine. In The Sign of the Four, 1890, Watson observes Holmes injecting cocaine and expresses concern, but treats it as a character quirk rather than alarming behavior. Holmes describes cocaine as mental stimulation, a way to relieve the boredom between cases. This depiction reflects Victorian attitudes. Cocaine used by educated, refined men is sophisticated self-medication. It's not addiction, it's pharmaceutical enhancement of natural genius. Doyle later regrets this portrayal. As cocaine's dangers become undeniable, he writes stories showing Holmes overcoming his habit, portraying it as weakness. But the damage is done. Sherlock Holmes popularizes the image of cocaine as the drug of brilliant, tortured minds. This archetype persists. Throughout 20th and 21st centuries, cocaine is associated with high-functioning intensity. Stockbrokers, artists, musicians, anyone pursuing excellence through artificial enhancement. It's the drug of ambition, of people who work too hard and play too hard. This mythology obscures reality. Most cocaine users aren't brilliant. They're ordinary people who got addicted through medical prescribing, recreational experimentation, or desperate self-medication. And cocaine doesn't enhance genius, it creates delusions of capability while degrading actual performance. As cocaine becomes criminalized in the 1910s-20s, cultural depictions shift dramatically. Now cocaine appears in moral panic literature and films warning of social decay. Cocaine, 1922, also called The Pace That Kills, is an exploitation film depicting cocaine as destroying a young woman's life, leading to prostitution and death. It's sensationalist garbage, but it shapes public perception. Cocaine is no longer sophisticated medicine, it's moral poison. The racist panic about cocaine and Black Americans appears in newspapers and dime novels. Stories depict cocaine-crazed Negroes committing heinous crimes, requiring heroic white police to restore order. These narratives aren't based on evidence, they're propaganda justifying segregation, police violence, and disenfranchisement. Similar racist narratives emerge around Chinese immigrants and opium, Mexican immigrants and marijuana. Each wave of drug panic targets a marginalized group, using exaggerated or fabricated stories of drug-fueled violence to justify oppression. By mid-century, cocaine largely disappears from mainstream American culture. Heroin and marijuana dominate drug discourse.
Cocaine is considered old-fashioned, a Victorian relic. Then, in the 1970s-80s, cocaine roars back. The rise of cocaine in 1970s-80s America is complex, driven by multiple factors: increased production in Colombia, declining
Heroin markets, growing wealth inequality creating both desperate poverty and excessive luxury, cultural shifts toward materialism and individualism. Cocaine becomes associated with disco, nightlife, wealth, celebrity. Studio 54 in New York is synonymous with cocaine use. Movies like Scarface, 1983, depict cocaine empires with operatic violence. Wall Street bankers use cocaine to work longer hours chasing bigger bonuses. The cultural message is contradictory. Cocaine is glamorous and deadly, luxurious and destructive, the drug of winners and the drug that destroys you. This contradiction reflects reality. Cocaine does both. It provides short-term confidence and energy while causing long-term disaster. But the cultural emphasis on glamour makes it seductive, especially to young people seeking success and status. Then, crack cocaine emerges in the 1980s, and the narrative splits along race and class lines. Crack is cocaine that's been processed into smokable form. Chemically, it's the same drug. But crack is cheaper, produces a faster high, and becomes associated with poor Black urban communities. Media coverage of crack versus powder cocaine is starkly different. Powder cocaine used by wealthy white people is treated as personal failing, reported with euphemisms, prosecuted leniently. Crack use by poor Black people is treated as existential social threat, reported with racialized hysteria, prosecuted with mandatory minimum sentences that are 100 times harsher than penalties for powder cocaine. The crack baby panic of the 1980s-90s claims that prenatal crack exposure causes permanent, irreversible damage. Media reports describe a generation of crack babies who will never function normally, placing enormous burdens on society. Pregnant crack users are prosecuted for child abuse. Later research shows the crack baby panic was wildly exaggerated. Prenatal cocaine exposure does cause problems, but no worse than prenatal alcohol exposure, and many affected children recover with proper care. The panic was fueled by racism and desire to criminalize Black mothers. But the damage is done. Thousands of Black women are imprisoned. Thousands of children are removed from families. Entire communities are destabilized by mass incarceration driven by crack sentencing disparities. Cultural representations enable this. When media consistently depicts crack as a Black drug and associates it with violence, degradation, and social collapse, it becomes easy to justify draconian policies. Meanwhile, powder cocaine continues flowing through wealthy white communities with relatively little legal consequence. The dichotomy is blatant. Same drug, different form, different user demographics, completely different social and legal responses. This is the continuation of Victorian-era patterns. Cocaine is medicine or menace depending on who uses it. White doctor's prescription or wealthy banker's indulgence versus Black user's crime. In literature and film, cocaine continues appearing as symbol of excess, corruption, moral decay. Blow, 2001, Traffic, 2000. Breaking Bad, though focused on meth, explores similar themes. All depict drug trade as violent, corrupting, ultimately self-destroying. These narratives contain truth. Drug trade is violent, prohibition creates corruption, but they often miss the systemic causes. Individual choices are emphasized while policy failures, economic desperation, and structural inequality are downplayed. The mythology of cocaine, the brilliant detective, the fallen woman, the violent addict, the wealthy hedonist, the doomed gangster, all contain fragments of reality, but none capture the full truth. The full truth is more boring and more tragic. Cocaine is a powerful stimulant that feels good briefly and causes widespread harm, and our society's responses to it have been shaped more by racism, classism, and economic interest than by science or compassion. Cultural representations matter because they influence policy. When society sees drug users as criminals rather than patients, we build prisons instead of treatment centers. When we associate drugs with marginalized groups, we criminalize those groups. When we glamorize drugs, we encourage use. The Victorian cocaine epidemic was enabled by cultural narratives that framed it as progress. The modern drug war is enabled by cultural narratives that frame it as necessary violence against dangerous others. Both narratives are wrong, and both cause immense suffering. We've spent more than 2 hours exploring how Victorian society embraced cocaine as miracle medicine, created an addiction epidemic, destroyed countless lives, and learned almost nothing. Because here we are, 140 years later, repeating the pattern. The opioid crisis of the 1990s-2020s follows the Victorian cocaine playbook almost exactly. Pharmaceutical company aggressively markets addictive drug. Purdue Pharma markets Oxycontin, claiming it's less addictive than other opioids. It isn't.
Doctors prescribe enthusiastically based on limited evidence. Physicians prescribe opioids for chronic pain, believing pharmaceutical marketing over their own clinical judgment. Patients become addicted. Hundreds of thousands develop opioid use disorder. Pharmaceutical company denies responsibility, blames misuse. Purdue claims problems are due to patients taking pills improperly. Regulation tightens, but too late. Prescription monitoring and restrictions implemented after millions are addicted. Criminal market emerges.
Street heroin and fentanyl replace prescription opioids. Overdose deaths increase. Users are criminalized and stigmatized. Despite addiction being a medical condition created by medical system, users face arrest and social condemnation. Marginalized communities suffer most. Poor communities, rural communities, indigenous communities face highest overdose rates and least access to treatment. Settlement allows company to avoid full accountability. Purdue Pharma declares bankruptcy, settles for billions, sounds like a lot, but a small fraction of profits. Sackler family remains wealthy, no executives go to prison. It's the same story. The names change, the drugs change, the pattern remains. Why do we keep repeating this? Economic incentives. Pharmaceutical companies profit from drug sales. They fund medical research, medical education, political campaigns. This creates systemic bias toward approving and promoting new drugs, even when long-term safety data is limited. Regulatory capture. The agencies supposed to regulate pharmaceutical companies are often staffed by former industry executives and funded partly by industry fees. FDA approval processes are faster in the US than other developed nations, not because American science is better, but because industry pressure prioritizes speed over caution. Medical culture. Doctors are trained to intervene, to prescribe, to do something. Wait and see feels like abandoning patients. Pharmaceutical companies exploit this by marketing drugs as compassionate treatment, making doctors feel like refusing to prescribe is denying care. Capitalist healthcare. In systems where healthcare is profit-driven, treating chronic conditions with expensive pharmaceuticals is more profitable than addressing root causes through lifestyle changes, therapy, or social support. A patient on lifelong medication is a revenue stream. Individualism and stigma. American culture particularly emphasizes individual responsibility and stigmatizes weakness. This makes it easy to blame drug users for addiction while ignoring systemic causes. If you're addicted, it's because you made bad choices, not because your doctor prescribed addictive medication, you are experiencing untreated depression, and you live in a society with inadequate mental health support. Criminalization reflex. When drug problems emerge, the political responses almost always get tough on crime, rather than improve treatment access. This is because criminalization is visible, immediate, and appeals to voters' fear. Treatment is slow, expensive, and lacks dramatic photo opportunities. Racism and classism. Drug policy continues to be shaped by which groups use which substances. When white suburban teens overdose on opioids, it's a public health crisis requiring compassion. When black urban residents use crack, it was a crime wave requiring mass incarceration. The double standard persists. Lack of historical memory. Most doctors aren't taught pharmaceutical history. Medical schools don't spend significant time on the cocaine epidemic, the thalidomide disaster, the amphetamine overprescribing of the 1960s-70s. Without historical knowledge, each generation of physicians believes this time is different. But it's not different. The fundamental dynamics remain: powerful corporations seeking profit, doctors with limited time and information, patients suffering and desperate for relief, regulators unable or unwilling to stand against industry pressure, and cultural narratives that blame users rather than systems. What would it take to break this cycle? Separate pharmaceutical profit from medical research. Publicly fund drug development, removing the profit motive from pharmaceutical research. This would slow innovation but improve safety. Longer approval processes with mandatory long-term studies. No drug should be mass-marketed without at least 10 years of safety data. This means some beneficial drugs would be delayed, but it would prevent epidemics. Limit pharmaceutical marketing to doctors and eliminate direct-to-consumer advertising. The US and New Zealand are the only developed nations allowing prescription drug advertising to consumers. It should be banned. Treat addiction as public health issue, not criminal issue. Decriminalize drug possession, fund treatment on demand, support harm reduction, needle exchanges, safe consumption sites, drug checking. Address root causes.
Use. Most addiction stems from trauma, mental illness, social isolation, economic desperation. Addressing these requires robust social support systems, mental health care, economic opportunity. Expensive, politically difficult, but effective. Hold pharmaceutical executives personally liable. Criminal prosecution for executives who knowingly market dangerous products. Not corporate fines that are absorbed as cost of doing business, but personal accountability. Teach pharmaceutical history in medical schools. Every physician should learn the cocaine story, the thalidomide story, the opioid story. They should understand that medical authority has been wrong before and will be wrong again. None of this will happen easily. All of it threatens powerful interests. So we'll probably keep repeating the cycle. The next miracle drug will be marketed aggressively. Doctors will prescribe it enthusiastically. Patients will suffer. Eventually, regulations will tighten, companies will settle, and we'll move on to the next crisis. Unless we decide to learn. The Victorian cocaine epidemic isn't just history, it's prophecy. It shows us exactly what happens when we combine capitalist incentives, medical hubris, inadequate regulation, and cultural prejudice. It maps the territory we keep returning to.
We could choose a different path. We could build systems that prioritize patient welfare over profit, that treat addiction with compassion, that hold corporations accountable, that learn from past disasters. We could, but will we? The Victorian dead can't answer. They can only warn. The year is 1884, and somewhere in London, a mother gives her crying child cocaine toothache drops. The bottle promises safety. The pharmacist assures her. The child stops crying. She feels relief. She doesn't know she's participating in a vast, uncontrolled experiment that will destroy thousands of lives and teach lessons her society will refuse to learn. The year is 2026, and somewhere in America, a doctor prescribes a new miracle drug for chronic pain. The pharmaceutical rep has assured her it's safe. The patient is desperate for relief. The prescription is filled. No one knows what will be discovered 10 years from now. We've traveled through decades of medical hubris, pharmaceutical greed, colonial exploitation, racist drug policy, and the suffering of millions of ordinary people who trusted doctors, who believed marketing, who were simply unlucky enough to be sick in an age when medicine was more confident than competent. What do we take from this history? That medical authority is fallible, that profit motives corrupt healthcare, that new discoveries require humility, not enthusiasm, that addiction is a medical condition, not moral failing, that drug policy has always been shaped more by racism and classism than by science, that the people who suffer most are never the people who profit most, and that we keep making the same mistakes because learning would require changing systems that powerful people benefit from maintaining. The Victorian cocaine epidemic is a ghost story, but the ghost isn't dead. It walks through our pharmaceutical industry, our criminal justice system, our cultural narratives about drugs and users and who deserves compassion. Until we confront that ghost, until we genuinely reckon with what cocaine's history teaches, we're doomed to keep recreating variations of the same disaster. But tonight, you've learned. You know the story now. You know how easily medicine becomes harm, how quickly miracle cures become epidemics, how thin the line between helping and hurting actually is. Carry that knowledge carefully. Be skeptical of miracle drugs. Question medical authority. Demand evidence. Support treatment over criminalization. Remember the Victorian dead, and honor them by refusing to repeat their mistakes. If you found value in this deep dive into pharmaceutical darkness, consider subscribing, hit the like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. There are dozens more historical disasters and human follies waiting to be explored. Thank you for spending these hours with me in the uncomfortable truth of the past. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and wake grateful that you live in an age with slightly better pharmaceutical regulation, though only slightly. Good night.